You all are doing fantastic work, and I don't think that we thank you enough. Allow me, on behalf of the rest of the continent, to thank you for the sacrificial labor of love that you do. Most grateful to have you. And I'm grateful to the East Africa Philanthropy forum colleagues, and Evans, that is most probably the most consequential speech I've heard in philanthropy in a long time. And I hope that we all will remember some of the key highlights. I was taking notes of your speech, which is emancipation without systems is fragile. Systems without power are empty or hollow things. And this idea that power that is not built here cannot be shared here, and wealth that's not built here cannot be shared here. And the powerful point that you make about if we woke up in this idyllic future and all the people who give us funding, bilateral, private, and others were not there, would we survive? The one answer is that our ancestors survived without the funders. We heard last night from Dr. Marisa about the contraction of aid. We heard from our guest of honor and our host here in Ethiopia just about certain very important things. And we've spent time critiquing philanthropy, Irungu, about how philanthropy preserves the status quo, that elite philanthropy tends to protect the economic and political systems that created inequality in the first place, rather than supporting structural reforms. And in essence, in the West, there have been these campaigns of higher taxes for those who are super rich and protection of labor. And that elites do favor solutions that leave their wealth and power intact or untouched. We've also had this criticism of philanthropy that doing good substitutes for doing less harm. That what we end up doing is sanitizing the obtuse, vulgar consequences of neoliberalism. That elites tend to focus on charitable giving instead of addressing the harmful practices that are innate in the business model that they apply, whether it's in the extraction of resources or in services or in financialization. We've also had the critique that win-win ideology limits real change. That this dominant belief that solutions will benefit both business and society in a win-win, the mindset rules out solutions that require, as we've learned in Ethiopia, as we've learned in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, redistribution in the economy, regulation, and sacrifices from those who are uber-rich and powerful. It looks like it is the poor that must constantly sacrifice their environment, sacrifice potential for clean water, clean air, sacrifice the quality of their soil, sacrifice the quality of their food. We've also had the critique that philanthropy tends to focus on symptoms rather than causes. That these elite initiatives that we are engaged in often address surface level problems, e.g. access, efficiency, and entrepreneurship, rather than deeper causes like Evans, you said, like unequal power structures or political decision. And that this leads to incremental or cosmetic change instead of systemic transformation. That we keep on hoping that there will be change. But we've also had, and this is true, that concentration of power and lack of accountability, that philanthropy allows very wealthy individuals to shape public priorities and social policy without democratic accountability. They make decisions about societal problems and shift that responsibility from the governments and others. That this idea of moral cover and legitimacy for inequality, that giving by elites helps to legitimize extreme wealth by portraying the rich as the problem solvers, as the leaders, as the benefactors. This can reduce public pressure for redistribution, as we already said, and make inequality appear more accessible. But we've also had the accusation that this space that we call philanthropy has enabled elite control of ideas and discourse. That through funding think tanks, NGOs, and so-called thought leaders, philanthropists shape how problems are framed and which solutions are considered acceptable, often excluding the more radical or redistributive initiatives. The bottom line is that those who are in philanthropy argue we are necessary because we bring speed and flexibility. We allow actors to respond rapidly and we experiment with solutions. We avoid bureaucratic delays and the typical public institution corruption. Now, we also claim in philanthropy that we are innovative and risk-taking. That as private donors, we make it possible, particularly for governments, to de-risk certain things. And resource mobilization from philanthropy allows us to fill gaps in development, that we bring pluralism and diversity. It enables us to approach different actors, that we give to the rich a moral responsibility to give back. Now, there are tensions, obviously, and this conference will discuss, as our eminent leader has said, between efficiency and legitimacy. Philanthropy emphasizes speed and results, while critics emphasize democratic oversight, fairness, and transformative interventions. Now, voluntary action versus structural reform. Now, this argument we will have for a long time. Innovation versus equality and equity. There is philanthropy complementing what governments are doing, both at a local and national level, regional level, or is it substituting? Now, I don't know how you will answer these questions. Of course, in philanthropy, we always say that we complement. But if we're looking for a philanthropy that is truly transformative and developmental, I wanted to suggest certain things. It must be locally anchored on local capital pathways. We must stop being the end user of capital and become the co-designer of that capital. Less than 10% of global philanthropic funding to Africa goes directly to African organizations. The highest number of intermediaries are not African. I accept they may love Africa. I accept they may employ Africans, but let's tell the truth. In Zanzibar, we talked about decoloniality and talked about decolonization of power within global capital and global philanthropy and global development. We will not get to that. Transformative capital transfer means not just long-term unrestricted funding. It means African-led, owned, controlled decision-making on where we make investment, what invest in, and why we invest. Blended finance structures designed in Africa may be good. Domestic resource mobilization, good. But localization without sovereignization becomes an exercise of sanitized colonialism in the new age. I want to suggest to you that the catalytic pooled funds we've been talking about are necessary. They may help us to de-risk in the area of climate adaptation, digital infrastructure, health systems, creative industries, and youth unemployment. But here is the tragedy. All our governments, except 5, have adopted philanthropy laws from colonial era, where you only have 3 categories: for-profit, non-profit, and companies limited by guarantees. If you ask the lawyers, why are those the categories we use? They have no good explanation except that they are English and French. and American masters trained them that way. And I keep saying, your mother, your grandmother, was both a philanthropist, a for-profit grandmother, because she was Mama Mboga, and non-profit, because she would bring everyone in the neighborhood to support. That integration is important. The African diaspora is overtaxed, taxed where they work, and when they send money, they are overcharged. And normally, what had happened until the current moment we're in, where Africans are no longer wanted in America, no longer wanted in Europe, no longer wanted anywhere. And now you have to have a big bond before you can travel to certain countries. Even if you are going for the Olympics, you may not be allowed. Is that it has brought a new reality. The escape route that the middle class had to escape from the penury and the misery and the structural inequality produced elsewhere in their own countries. That escape route has been closed, and the chickens are coming home to roost. And that means what we need to do is ask ourselves, what is diaspora-driven co-investment? The African diaspora sends to Africa 100 billion. Very few of our countries actually have moved beyond having a diaspora directorate, a diaspora desk, to actually think about the link between diaspora investment and social infrastructure, social policy. If you take a narrow fiscalist approach to diaspora investment, you divorce it from economic structural transformation. Because it is not that the diaspora are giving to roads and infrastructure and stuff. It is that the diaspora resources, just that 100 billion, is enough for us to increase the number of women in technology, the women in finance, and the women in science. It's enough for us to increase farm storage and processing and microprocessing. But it requires the diaspora and African governments not to engage in these ad hoc engagements. One visit to the diaspora, a few smart diaspora people make suggestions, no. But it requires the philanthropists that work in the country to stop being addictive recipients of capital, to have the mindset that I think you were talking about, which was the mindset of wealth creation. Only 15% of you in the room, and I studied your bios, have any understanding of capital markets, of finance, and how actually finance help. And I know all of you are very unhappy about injustice and inequality, about the oppression of women, the oppression of young people. But you don't have the understanding of the one thing that has been the driver of our colonization: capital. And so when we started talking about capital in this space, you were only focused on finance. And you were focused on how to increase the flows and make them predictable, as opposed to how to create them, how to retain them, how to grow them. So that means the people who must be in this room together with you are people responsible for security in our countries, are people responsible for banking and finance in our countries, are for people. Philanthropy in Africa must posit itself not as a charity sector, but it must be a war room to address questions of continental security in an age where we are being reduced to a space where others want to contract, others want to extract, and others want to build new colonies for security, for critical minerals, and other things. If this space does not transform, and we continue simply to talk about how to make what we do more efficient, we will be the most powerful agent for Africa's recolonization. So, trust-based philanthropy is good, but what is the sovereign capital mobilization that Africa needs? What is that new financial architecture, ministers? What are those regional liquidity pools? What are those sovereign wealth funds? How do we create a domestic and regional market for philanthropy in Africa? How do we leverage public funds to enable philanthropic funds, not simply to complement charity, but to expand the tools? I'm asking us this week not to come and show off the little instruments that we have developed for purposes of making efficient poverty amelioration, and then we say the people have voice. If I'm going to have voice, at least give me the knowledge to talk about all the other things that the people who sent you talk about. If I only have voice to talk about how to suffer less, to have clean drinking water, it's important. But if the destiny of countries that won battles at Adwa, countries that liberated themselves from Chimurenga, is clean drinking water, then that liberation is far from over. Right? Economic liberation requires that we rewire the architecture of capital, not just by establishing funds, but by changing the regulations on how we structure finance and financing internally and regionally, and by changing how we pool and use public resources to enable private resources, but how we use private capital to enable public-led investment. So if we are to do this domestic resource mobilization, this diaspora wealth fund, it's no longer enough to have a wealthy Irungu launch a fund or a wealthy Brian launch a fund. It was good to have high net worth individuals, but that model will not work adequately for us because the oligarchs from somewhere else have created instability in their neighborhoods. They are either exporting war, or now they need a place to take their capital, which is a lot more than your own capital, and that will make the cost of money seemingly cheap, but will increase indebtedness because a debt alcoholism will grow in the public sector. When a debt alcoholism grows in the public sector, who are borrowing from private lenders, where there are no real regulations around interest chargeable, it means that debt is being transferred to the same households that you and I are trying to provide clean drinking water, are trying to provide. So the efficiency of the tools and the instruments, the efficiency of the architecture will not matter until we also address global power. I know that Irungu, you are worried. Today I'm a little bit more disciplined than I normally am. We need to build new narratives as co-authored, not just beneficiaries. This is not a moment for incrementalism. This is a moment, as Everett said, for courageous institutional change and reimagination. The world that is shifting around us, the aid that is shrinking, the oligarchic and plutocratic power that is consolidating, and that is increasing its focus on African assets, African land, African critical minerals, essentially means this sector has also become, together with our governments and regional institutions, a space for self-defense, a space for self-actualization, but a space for radical reimagination. Our mountaintop is no longer about excluding impunity, misery, and corruption. Our mountaintop is to stop being permanent slaves. Here are 5 ways, and I'll be quick and shut up. Number 1, I don't think we have a choice but to move towards hybrid organization models, not just in this sector, but in other sectors. We must incentivize African public state-owned enterprises to look at philanthropic arms possibilities. We must incentivize African private sector to look at philanthropic arm possibilities. We must incentivize African labor unions and African workers to look at these possibilities. But we must therefore change the laws to make community equity funds, community endowments a possibility, not subject to overtaxation, not subject to discrimination and ghettoization within the banking sector. We must also look at this impact-linked financing, whether it's social impact bonds, development impact bonds. We have been good at doing government bonds, but a good number of them are not linked to social impact. They're not linked to development impact. I'm suggesting that we need a rethink, and all the finance experts, all the investment experts need to look at this. Now we already have digital crowdfunding, ask Kenyans, ask staff, but it does not have an infrastructure. Because it doesn't have an infrastructure, its regulation is based on fear, and I am suggesting that given the number of young Africans who have no access to capital, but we may have little limited resources that if pulled, just 1 million young Ethiopians pulling together funds can cause some radical transformation in terms of their access to some services. And that's the same for Zimbabweans, for Kenyans. But we need to build the legislative infrastructure. Lastly, we always talk about cross-sector partnerships. I want to suggest to you, colleagues, that please be careful about the fetish, the myth of results and solutions. These are terms that we've nicely borrowed from corporate philanthropy, and I am a representative of global philanthropy. So please, I'm going to say this, and I want you to understand that I have seen how we bring models, try and apply them to societies that actually, as I said in Zanzibar, have managed to educate their children, to attend to weddings and to funerals and etc. without these models. We have failed to interpret what is it that makes Africans spend more on funerals than on life. Now, don't berate it. Simply ask, how can we create transformative funding that goes beyond one funeral from how people are impelled to give? What is it that makes Africans spend more on education, like familial education, and than they do on, let's say, issues of creating community-shared impact? Do the Africans have the infrastructure, Irungu? And that's my last point. Yes, they do. I talked last time about the SACCOs, the Chamas, the Susus, and etc. Please stop trying to bring another infrastructure from Harvard, from Yale, from Stanford. Keep it there. Very soon, with the rate at which things are going in the US, you may need us to come and build your capacity on Chamas and SACCOs. For now, what we need is to deal not how to corporatize Chamas and SACCOs. If the Stokvels in South Africa have reached 50 billion rands annually, and the Chamas and SACCOs have in excess of 13 billion shillings in investment, we must be studying how, using that indigenous framework, we can generate value beyond the immediacy. How then we can ask government and the banking sector and insurance to de-risk, to help that financing to move into building community-level infrastructure, building manufacturing competencies, and creating jobs. So I essentially just came to agree with Evans that it's not just that wealth that's not made here cannot be shared. I came to say to you, the problem of those who are trying to promote community empowerment is they talk about entrepreneurship. They themselves will die if they lost their jobs. They are committed to their salaries and they want to teach communities to be entrepreneurs. So we want to do entrepreneurship. Let's start here. May God bless you.